What I wish to share with you today is a psychology of liberation, a psychology that chooses to empower, to liberate people, a psychology that is critical of the social norms that bind us, limit us, constrain us. In particular, this psychology of liberation is critical of systems and structures that oppress and marginalize people, stigmatizing people for their gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, for being transgender, gay, bisexual, lesbian, intersex, queer, for the diversity of humanity. This psychology seeks to liberate all of us from these norms. What we wish to create is a vision of a world that is gender inclusive, gender diverse, and gender loving. Now, how can we achieve this vision? We will draw from insights from critical discursive psychology, a psychology that is critical of the structures, institutions, systems that oppress and understands how these oppressions are experienced by people in their everyday lives. And what mediates, what links, structures, and experiences is language. It is through language that oppressive systems are supported, that oppression is justified. It is language that co-creates reality, that constitutes reality. And so it is in this language that systems draw power from talk, text, words, from the discursive. And it is also in this very language that we will draw our power to challenge these very systems that oppress. So it is in the power of words that we will draw our power. Now, we will do this through a story. A few years back, and I was teaching psychology of gender and sexuality, I remember a particular moment, and we heard of news, a public event, where a national icon, a public figure, uttered the following words to the LGBT community. Kung lalaki sa lalaki, babae sa babae, mas masahol pa sa hayop ang tao. If people then engage in male-to-male, female-to-female relations, then they are worse than animals. Worse than animals. I know this might be particularly triggering, and I hope you can stay with me when I ask you this question. If someone tells you, you're worse than an animal, masahol ka pa sa hayop, how would you feel? What would that make you think? What would that make you do? When these words were uttered in the public sphere, people from our LGBT community, friends, even my own students started sharing how hurt they felt. It was a sense of being diminished. It was shame. It was being made to feel less, feeling of disempowerment. And I remember one particular moment when members of the LGBT academe, allies, psychologists came together to problematize this issue. And we were watching the video, and some of them watching the video of the interview for the first time, and people in the room crying and breaking down. It was sheer devastation. So much hurt coming from those words uttered by this national icon. What I wish to stress at this point is how language has the power to shape how people will feel, what people will think, what people will do. Language shapes subjectivities. Something else happened when those words were uttered. And I remember friends, colleagues, students coming to me sharing stories of how their own friends started telling them that there's something wrong with them. Their own family members started to confront them that there's something wrong with them and that they have to change. It was as if all of a sudden, the prejudice that was once hidden was now in full view. People were experiencing blatant discrimination, direct rejection, stigma from people they thought accepted them for who they were, for who they are, for their sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression. What we are seeing here is that language produces discrimination, prejudice, shaming. It can shape what people will do, what institutions will do, if it will police SOGI, if it will exclude people, if it will deny LGBT people rights. Language shapes social practices. Now, this language that shapes subjectivities and practices, these words are anchored on discourses, ideas about the world, ways of constructing the world and people. It is a way of seeing the world. Do we see the world as sinful, not sinful, moral, not moral, right, good, evil? This discourse can be a religious discourse, a religious lens that judges people as righteous or not, moral or not. It could even come from psychology, seeing people, evaluating people as normal, abnormal, acceptable, not acceptable. A medical discourse that will label people as pathological, not pathological, disordered, not disordered. These discourses will shape how we live in the world. Our way of seeing then translates to a way of being. If one is seen and treated as different, then one feels different. If one is seen and treated as less, then one feels less. One feels abnormal, sinful, immoral, judged, ridiculed, excluded, diminished. To feel less of a human being. A discourse is a way of seeing and a way of being. Now I will return to our story when another public figure, a celebrity, was one of the first people who stood against this national icon and uttered these words. I am not begging you for my dignity. I am not begging you for respect. I am not begging you for my humanity because you do not own my humanity. Akin yun. That is mine. That is my birthright. In one moment, with these words, this person has reclaimed the dignity of the LGBT community, the humanity, the respect of people, telling people that we will not be diminished, we will not be made less. Through language, our talk, text, words, we have the power to counterposition and reposition. We can change the discourse. We can claim respect. We can claim that we are people too. And this public figure, this celebrity continued that we in the LGBT community, we will fight for our rights to equality, to dignity because these were stolen from us. Ninakaw ito sa amin, ang aming mga karapatan. And in that moment, the discourse has shifted, the narrative has shifted. A counter-discourse of reclaiming human rights for LGBT people, reclaiming equality and freedom. The beauty of language is that at any given moment, at any point in time, we can change the narrative. We can change the story. We can shift the conversation. We can change the discourse. A counter-discourse that empowers, an alternative discourse that liberates. Can be a human rights discourse, an equality discourse, a discourse from psychology that affirms the diversity of gender and sexuality, recognizes that all forms of soji are normal, acceptable, legitimate, valid, and good. A discourse that can change the world. And in the midst of all that talk, going back to our story, in the midst of all the public talk, coming from those hurtful words, some members of our LGBT community, friends, families, allies, found solace in the words of a Jesuit, an LGBT ally, Father James Martin. And this is what he had to say. No issue brings about so much hatred among so many Catholics as homosexuality. The Catholic Church has to do a much better job of teaching that we should treat our LGBT brothers and sisters with respect, sensitivity, and compassion. But God wants more. God wants us to love. And not a twisted, narrow tolerance, but actual love, real love, infinite love, God's love. A discourse that calls us to love everyone for all that they are. For being transgender, for being cisgender, straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, gender fluid, gender non-binary, they, them, he, him, she, her. We are called to love. A love discourse. And so, I will end with these words. May we love ourselves and each other, not despite of who we are, but precisely because of who we are. To love not from shame, but from pride. To love with pride.